The envelope was white, letter-sized. My name written on the front in my mother's handwriting. The looping cursive she had used on every birthday card since I was 5 years old. Inside was $200 in crisp $50 bills and a note card that said, "Simply, we hope this helps you get settled." I stood in my parents' living room, holding it while my sister signed paperwork for the house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, and the vacation property in Vermont that my father had been paying into since 1994. Nobody looked at me. Nobody said anything. The lawyer shuffled his papers and my mother adjusted. Her cardigan and my sister clicked her pen. And the room smelled like the lavender. Plug-in my mother kept by the front door and old coffee going cold in a pot. Nobody had thought to turn off. Welcome back to BetrayalLedger, where family secrets never stay buried for long. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and join the family, because this story is one of the wildest ones we've ever told. Let's get into it. My name is Megan Calloway. I am 34 years old, and the day my parents handed my sister everything they had ever built, and handed me $200 in an envelope, I finally understood that some decisions had been made about me long before I was old enough to have any say in them. My parents, Frank and Diane Calloway, lived in a 4-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Ridge Road in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where every lawn had an edged border and every driveway had a basketball hoop, and the houses had been built in the 80s, with the kind of solid, unflashy materials that were meant to last. Frank had worked for an insurance company for 31 years, rising slowly and steadily through actuarial departments, until he was managing a team of 12 and carrying a title that impressed people at dinner parties without meaning much to anyone outside the industry. Diane had taught 3rd grade for 24 years and then retired when her knees started complaining about the classroom floors. They were not wealthy in the way that made the news, but they were wealthy in the quiet American way, the way built from decades of steady income and low spending, and a house that had appreciated and retirement accounts that had compounded, and a vacation property bought cheap in 1994, when Vermont real estate was still affordable and held on to through every market dip because Frank did not believe in panic selling. My sister Joanna was 3 years older than me. She was the kind of person who had always seemed to exist in slightly better lighting than everyone else, not because she was more beautiful or more talented, but because she understood instinctively how to position herself in a room. She had married a man named Craig Whitfield at 28, a corporate attorney with good posture and a firm handshake, and the particular confidence of someone who had never once doubted that the world was arranged in his favor. They lived 20 minutes from my parents in a house, with a red front door and a 2-car garage and 2 children, who said please and thank you with the ease of kids who had been coached since birth. Joanna volunteered at the school. She hosted Thanksgiving. She called my mother every Sunday at 11 in the morning, and I know the time because my mother mentioned it, often enough that it became a fact I carried without choosing to. I need you to understand something before I go any further. I was not the difficult child in any dramatic sense. I did not drop out of school. I did not have a substance problem. I did not disappear for years and resurface asking for money. I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in communications, moved to Chicago at 23, built a career in marketing that paid my rent and my student loans and left a little over at the end of each month that I put into a savings account the way my father had taught me. I had an apartment I liked and a job I was good at, and a cat named Biscuit who knocked things off shelves with the serene indifference of someone who knew they were loved regardless. My life was not glamorous. It was not the life Joanna had built on Sycamore Ridge Road with the red front door and the manicured lawn. But it was mine, assembled carefully, paid for honestly, and I had never once asked my parents for anything, beyond what parents give without being asked. What I was, and I understood this gradually over many years, the way you understand a weather pattern, by living through enough seasons, was simply not Joanna. That was the entire sum of my failing. I had not married Craig Whitfield or someone like him. I had not bought a house 20 minutes away. I had not called every Sunday at 11. I had built something real and independent and entirely my own, and in my family's particular accounting system, that registered as absence rather than achievement. The Sunday brunch conversations told me everything. I needed to know if I had been paying closer attention sooner. Frank would describe Joanna's new kitchen renovation with the specificity of a man genuinely invested in the outcome of her backsplash decision, and then he would turn to me and ask how work was going with the tone of someone completing a checklist. Diane would mention that Craig had been promoted or that Joanna had been asked to chair some school committee, and then she would say, "You should really think about buying property. Megan, renting is just throwing money away." and the subject of me would close like a door swinging shut on its own hinges. I drove back to Chicago. After those visits with the windows down and the highway, loud around me and the specific hollow feeling of someone who has just eaten a meal that contained no actual nutrition. 6 months before the envelope, my father called me on a Tuesday evening. I was eating leftover pasta at my kitchen counter. Biscuit arranged on the stool beside me like a small orange supervisor. Frank never called without a reason. He was not a phone call person. He sent texts that read like telegrams and reserved phone calls for information that needed to be delivered rather than discovered. "We've been working on the estate plan," he said. "Wanted to let you know we met with the attorney last week." I asked if everything was okay. "Fine, yes. Just getting things organized." A pause. The particular pause of someone who has decided how much they are going to say and is making sure they stay inside that decision. "You know your mother and I have always wanted to make sure things are handled properly." I said, "Of course." "Joanna's been very involved," he said, "helping us think through the details. She understands this kind of thing. Craig has been helpful too." I said that made sense. He said goodnight. I sat at my kitchen counter for a long time after that, Biscuit pressing his warm weight against my arm, the pasta going cold in the bowl, and I thought about the word involved and what it meant in the context of an estate plan, and what it meant that my father had called me on a Tuesday evening to tell me. My sister had been very involved in organizing something that concerned all of us. What I didn't know yet was that involved was a significant understatement. 3 weeks before the envelope, Joanna called me. She called me rarely enough that my phone screen showing her name was itself a small event. Her voice was warm and smooth and carefully calibrated, the way her voice always was when she wanted something to land a particular way. She said she was just checking in. She asked about Chicago, about work, about whether I was seeing anyone. She asked about Biscuit with the fond exasperation of someone performing affection for an audience of one. And then, at the end of the conversation, in the same tone she had used to ask about my cat, she said, "Mom and Dad's situation is pretty complicated, you know? Craig has been helping them restructure things. It's really in everyone's best interest to keep the assets consolidated." I asked her what she meant by consolidated. She laughed, light and brief. "Just that it makes more sense, financially, to keep things together, rather than split everything up. You know how complicated these things get. Craig says it's really the smartest approach." I said I understood. I did not understand, but I had learned something from 24 years of being Joanna's sister, which was that the moments when her voice went warmest were the moments she most needed me not to ask the next question. So I didn't ask it then. I waited. The morning of the will reading, I drove from Chicago to Columbus, 4 hours on the interstate with a podcast I didn't absorb and a coffee that went cold in the cup holder somewhere around Gary, Indiana. My parents were alive. This was not a posthumous reading. Frank and Diane had decided, at the attorney's suggestion, to walk both daughters through the estate documents, while everyone was present and capable of asking questions. It was, the attorney had apparently said, cleaner this way, more transparent. The attorney's name was Philip Garrett. He was 60, compact. With reading glasses, he kept pushing up his nose and the mild, practiced neutrality of someone paid to deliver information without editorializing. He sat at my parents' dining room table with a folder in front of him and a yellow legal pad beside it and a pen he kept clicking without seeming to notice. My parents sat at the heads of the table. Joanna sat across from me with Craig beside her. Craig, who had not been invited but had come anyway, and whom nobody had asked to leave. Philip Garrett opened the folder. The house on Sycamore Ridge Road to Joanna. The investment accounts, totaling approximately $840,000 to Joanna. The retirement funds to Joanna. The Vermont property to Joanna. A life insurance policy naming Craig Whitfield as secondary beneficiary behind Joanna. A separate, smaller account, approximately $12,000, designated for my parents' final expenses and any remaining balance to Joanna. Philip Garrett turned a page. To Megan Calloway, a one-time distribution of $200, intended to assist with any immediate transitional needs. The room was very quiet. The lavender plug-in hummed its synthetic floral note near the front door. The coffee pot on the counter ticked as it cooled. Craig clicked his pen twice, 3 times, and then stopped. Joanna looked at the table. My mother adjusted her cardigan. My father looked at Philip Garrett's folder as though reading it, again from across the table. I looked at my hands. They were flat on the table, perfectly still, and I made a decision in that moment that I have not regretted since. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Joanna or Craig or Philip Garrett. I looked at my mother, who was looking at her cardigan, and I said very quietly, "Can I ask when this was decided?" My father said, "These things take time to work through, Megan." My mother said, "We just wanted to keep things simple." Joanna said nothing. Craig clicked his pen once and put it in his breast pocket. Philip Garrett slid the white envelope across the table. $200 in crisp, $50 bills and a note card in my mother's looping cursive. I picked it up. I put it in my bag. I stood up, thanked Philip Garrett for his time, told my parents I would be in touch, and walked out of the house on Sycamore Ridge, rode for the last time as someone who believed she had a family that saw her. I drove back to Chicago with the windows up this time and the radio off and Biscuit's carrier on the back seat because I had brought him for the overnight stay. I had planned and was now not taking. He was quiet back there, just the occasional small sound of him shifting his weight. I talked to him the whole drive home. Not about anything specific, just talked. The way you talk when the silence is the wrong shape, and you need something to fill it that isn't grief. I called an attorney named Susan Park 2 days later, not because I believed I could overturn the will. Adults can leave their money to whoever they choose and no court was going to argue with. Frank and Diane Calloway's right to distribute their estate as they saw fit, but because I had a specific question, I needed answered by someone who understood the legal architecture of what had happened. I needed to know if Joanna had been involved in drafting the documents. I needed to know if Craig's fingerprints, metaphorically speaking, were on the restructuring my father had referenced on that Tuesday phone call. Susan Park was thorough. She was also expensive and worth every dollar. It took her 3 weeks and access to the county recorder's filings, and one very careful conversation with a former colleague of Philip Garrett's who had worked on an earlier version of my parents' estate plan 6 years ago. What she found was not illegal. Nothing Joanna had done crossed a legal line, but it was documented, clearly and completely. In a paper trail that told a story, Susan laid out for me across her conference table on a gray Thursday afternoon in November. Joanna and Craig had begun meeting with my parents' financial advisor 14 months ago. They had introduced Philip Garrett, who had replaced my parents' previous attorney of 20 years. Craig had prepared a consolidation memo, a document recommending that the estate assets be kept together rather than divided, citing tax efficiency and administrative simplicity. The memo had been presented to my parents as Craig's professional advice. Frank, who trusted credentials and firm handshakes, had received it as such. Diane, who trusted Joanna's judgment the way she trusted the Sunday call at 11, had signed where she was asked to sign. It was not illegal. It was very, very effective. Susan looked at me when she finished and said, "What do you want to do with this?" I thought about that for a long time. I thought about my father's voice on the Tuesday phone call, the particular pause of someone who had decided how much they were going to say. I thought about Joanna's warm, calibrated voice asking about Biscuit. I thought about my mother adjusting her cardigan and not meeting my eyes. I thought about $200 in crisp $50 bills and a note card that said, "We hope this helps you get settled." I made copies of everything Susan had found. I put them in a folder, and on a Sunday morning in December, I drove back to Columbus and I sat down at my parents' kitchen table without calling first, and I put the folder in front of my father, and I said, "I think you should read this." Frank Calloway read slowly. He turned each page carefully, the way he had always handled documents, with the precision of a man who had spent 31 years understanding that the details were where the truth lived. Diane sat beside him and read over his shoulder and said nothing. The coffee maker gurgled on the counter. The lavender plug-in hummed its same note. My father closed the folder. He did not look at me right away. He looked at the table, at his own hands, at the folder sitting between us like something that had always been there waiting to be found. "Craig wrote this," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. Another silence, long and heavy, and full of the specific weight of a man realizing that his trust in credentials and firm handshakes had been used as a tool against his own daughter. He picked up the phone. He called Philip Garrett. He asked for a meeting. The estate was restructured over the following 4 months. Not dramatically, not in a courtroom. In a series of quiet meetings between my father and a new attorney, a woman named Carol Briggs who came recommended by Susan Park, and who had the kind of steady, unflappable competence that made you believe things could actually be set right. Joanna did not take it quietly. There were phone calls and tears, and Craig wrote 2 more memos that nobody asked for. But Frank Calloway had spent 31 years reading documents for a living, and he had finally read the right one. And once he understood what had been done in the name of consolidation and efficiency and Craig's professional advice, There was no version of events in which he was going to leave it as it was. I did not get an apology, not a real one. My mother called in February and said things had been complicated, and she hoped I understood they had always wanted the best for both of their girls. And she used the word complicated 4 times in 6 minutes. My father sent me a letter, handwritten, 2 pages. That said more than he had said to me in 10 years of Sunday. Brunches and Tuesday phone calls and birthday cards with $50 inside. He said he had not seen what was in front of him. He said he was sorry for that. He used the word sorry once and meant it in a way that the word rarely gets meant. The revised documents arrived in March. My name was on them. Properly this time, in the place it should have been from the beginning. I drove back to Chicago with Biscuit on the back seat, and the windows down, and the early spring air, coming through cold and clean and carrying that particular smell of thaw, wet earth and last year's leaves finally releasing and something underneath. It all that was just new, just beginning, just air that had not yet decided what it was going to be. I put the white envelope in a drawer when I got home. The $200, the note card in my mother's looping cursive. I kept it not as a wound but as a record, a document, the kind of thing you keep so that when someone tells you it wasn't that bad, you can open the drawer and show them exactly what it was. Some things should be findable when you need them.